In just a second here when we get started, we're going to get started in chapter 23, right at the beginning of chapter 23 of the Gospel according to St. Matthew. And just to very quickly get us caught up, we're in what we now call Holy Week. We're now just a couple of days before Christ is going to be betrayed and crucified, and we've talked about how during this period, in these first few days of the week, Jesus and his disciples are going in and sort of occupying the temple where he's teaching, and at night they're leaving the city, staying outside. But so far for the past 3 days, he's been coming in and teaching in the temple publicly. And we saw last time there were a whole series of events where sort of everybody who was opposed to Jesus popped up like a whack-a-mole, right? Like one after the other, to try and test him, try and catch him, right? With some kind of tricky question or something. And so we had a whole series of these, and never worked out quite how they were hoping. They all at least ended up backfiring there, wandering off. And finally, at the end of chapter 22, Jesus finally asked them a question about whose son Messiah is, and they couldn't answer, and so they finally gave up and sort of slunk away. But as we're about to see at the beginning of chapter 23, the fact that they gave up, that it slunk away, doesn't mean Jesus was done talking to them. to the Philistines and the teachers of the law. And just to set the scene again, remember, we talked about how particularly at this time of year, Passover, at all the feasts, but particularly at Passover, there are people packing into Jerusalem. Thousands and thousands of people from all over the world packing into Jerusalem. There had been, within the last 20 years, an attempted revolt at Passover, right, that the Romans had to put down. So tensions are running high. Okay. And as we saw, Jesus started all this after in St. Matthew's Gospel, the triumphal entry happens, right? Palm Sunday. Everybody waves the palms, they welcome there as the Messiah. He proceeds to go in, drive all the moneylenders out of the temple, and occupy the space. Right? So, already people are on alert. And the chief priests and the temple rulers and the Pharisees and the scribes have now all come to try to get rid of him, and have all been told to go pound sand. Okay? So, you've got a big crowd of people there to hear Jesus, who are now riled up thinking he's the Messiah, right? Which is putting the Roman authorities on notice, right? They're on edge, right? Which is putting the Jewish leaders on edge, because the Jewish leaders, the last thing they want is the Romans storming into the temple. And desecrating the temple to go in there and get rid of Jesus and break up this mob, and or killing them and their family members, in retribution, if the Romans decide this is a mob going to be happening and they need to put down a revolt. Okay. So it's in this kind of highly charged atmosphere that Jesus says the kind of things that we're about to read. We've been told already that the Jewish authorities want him dead. That's how they see the solution to this problem. We need to get rid of him ourselves before the Romans come down on all of us. And now, Jesus is going to address them. These Pharisees. Temple. In Matthew 23, starting in verse 1. Then Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. But do not do according to their works. For they say and do not do. For they bind heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on men's shoulders. But they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all their work they do to be seen by men. They make their phylacteries broad and enlarge the borders of their garments. They love the best places at feasts, the best seats in the synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces, and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi. But you do not be called Rabbi, for one is your teacher, the Christ, and you are all brethren. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. And do not be called teachers, for one is your teacher, the Christ. But he who is great among you shall be your servant, and whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. So we'll pause there for a second. And the first thing, and a lot of times this gets glossed over in verse 2, this bit about the Pharisees sitting in Moses' seat. First of all, does anybody ever remember Moses having a seat? Right?
It wasn't recorded.
Right? He was kind of on the go. I mean, I'm sure he sat somewhere, sometime. But, I mean, it would have had to be some kind of sedan chair because he was on the go, right? He didn't make it into the promised land. So, right off the bat, there's a problem here if, like some of our, many of our Protestant brothers and sisters, you believe in sola scriptura, right? Because already here's a place where St. Matthew apparently doesn't, right? Because what he's talking about, this idea of Moses having a seat and him having successors who sit in it, right? That's nowhere in the scriptures, right? That this is a part of the tradition. Right? But Jesus isn't saying here, woe to you Pharisees, you made up this tradition about Moses having a chair and you sitting in it, right? So that you could lord it over people. He doesn't say that. He says just the opposite. He endorses this particular tradition. Right? This idea that Moses was the lawgiver, right? And then after him have come teachers of the law. Right? Where we talked about that all the way back in Deuteronomy, one of the primary jobs of the prophets who were going to come after Moses was to call people back to the law, right? To remind them of the law, to teach people the law, so that they could follow it, to teach them the Torah. So he's saying, look, the Pharisees, that's their job. So when they come to you, right, at the door, when they come to you and say, thou shalt not steal, right? Don't steal. Right? Listen to what they have to say. Right? When they're trying to teach you the scriptures. This tradition, this Jewish tradition that's getting referenced here, is closely connected with the role of bishops in the church, the understanding of bishops in the church. And that becomes especially important when you realize, of course, Matthew wrote this after the destruction of the temple. Right? So the only way this applies now to the people Matthew wrote it to, right? Was Matthew saying to them, oh, you should listen to what the Pharisees say? No. Right? So when St. Matthew writes it, he's talking about someone else. Right? He's talking about the leaders in the church community, right? Who we're going to call bishops. And bishops, the church has always used this terminology in terms of bishops. Bishops have a seat. Right? They have a chair. The Greek word for chair, transliterated into English, is cathedra. Cathedra. That big chair we have in the front of the church, where Bishop Thomas was sitting this morning, is called a cathedra. And the church where the bishop is, his home church, is the cathedral. Right? That comes from this idea of a seat. Right? Seat. So in the same way that Moses had successors, now in our time the apostles have successors. Right? And so what Jesus is saying here is to be obedient to those appointed church leaders. Even if what?
They're wrong.
Even if, like the Pharisees, they themselves don't do what they say. We're obedient to them because of their position. Because of the seat they sit in. Even if they themselves don't follow through on it. And of course, he then goes on to describe how the Pharisees don't follow through on it. What's the first thing he brings up? They bind heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on men's back. What's that referring to? That's referring to all the extra, where we talked about how they took the law, right? They took the commandments and then added all of their additional rules, their applications of those commandments, right? So you have to honor the Sabbath day. Well, that means you can't walk farther than this far, and you can't, you can only lift this much weight. You can only, do this and that. All these rules. So what do? They go and they find someone, the Pharisees. They go and they find someone, and what do? They try to make them a Pharisee like them. Right? So the Pharisee version of the gospel is them going up to their fellow Judeans and saying, hey, here's a whole pile of rules you need to follow if you want to be righteous. And you want to be one of us. Right? Not that appealing to most people. Right? And then Jesus says what? They won't lift a finger to much than themselves. Right? Pharisees aren't in the business of helping people who are burdened and who are weary. Right? They're in the business of burdening people. That's the contrast with Jesus. It's not that Jesus thinks, oh no, forget the law. Just go do whatever you want. Right? Again, that's not what he's teaching. But he's coming to people who know they've broken the law, who know they're sinners, because the Pharisees have been telling them their whole lives. Right? Who know they're sinners, who are struggling. Right? And what is Christ coming to do? Christ is coming to try to lift that burden off of them. Right? Try to help them. Which is a very different approach. Right? If you want to be righteous, you need to be like me, and you need to do this, that, and the other. Right? Versus, I can see that you're suffering and you're struggling, and I'm going to help you. The next thing they do, all their works they do to be seen by men. It's not that the things they're doing are bad, right? Praying is good, tithing is good, right? Giving is good, reading the scriptures is good. Okay? The problem is they need to do it all out in public on the street corner where everyone sees them doing it. Right? It's not what they're doing. Right? It's that if they're going to give a penny, they want a picture on the front page of the newspaper holding the giant check. Right? So everyone knows what a great charitable person they are. Right? They want everyone to know. Okay. And really, verse 6, they love the best place at the feast and the best seats in the synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces. Right? We call Rabbi, Rabbi. Right? They live for them. People tell them how smart they are and how wonderful they are and how righteous they are. Right? And oh, please sit in this place of honor. Please honor me. Right? Now I know there's no one in churches today who's like that at all. Who tries to draw attention to themselves, but ever, rather than to Christ. Right? But this is what Christ is pointing. See, again and again, they go around telling other people they need to be like them. They go out in public, want everyone to look at them. In the synagogue, they want everyone to be looking at them, they're concerned with them. So at the core of this is the fact that the Pharisees have made themselves their own idol. They made themselves their own idol. They're worshiping themselves rather than worshiping God.
Ron,
Yes.
how many Pharisees were there? Were there like 24, 36? I mean, there probably weren't that many. Are they like bishops? There were just a few here and there.
They were a sect. They were spread out all over the Roman world at this point. But I mean, probably in Judea, there were probably, at this time around Pascha, you probably had 1.2 million people stuffed in around Jerusalem. And I mean stuffed. at Pascha this time. Probably there were maybe 20,000 Pharisees out of that.
I didn't think there'd be that many.
Yeah. It would be part of that part.
Never mind. The Pope's stormtroopers.
Yeah, people who were officially, who had dedicated themselves and were part of that. Then, of course, they had a following.
Were these all from the Pharisees and the Sadducees, all from the Levites?
No. In fact, the Sadducees were not Levites. They were the ones who controlled the high priesthood, and they were not Levites. As you remember back in 1 Maccabees, Judas Maccabeus made his brother Simon the high priest. So yeah, they were not legit. That's why they remember in Ezekiel, there was that prophecy that the true priests of the true temple would be descended from Zadok, and that's where the word Sadducee comes from. The Zadok in there, the consonants, they literally called themselves the Zadokites, which they weren't. But they called themselves that because they identified as Zadokites.
What religious training the Sadducees and the Pharisees had?
Well, the Sadducees and Pharisees are totally different.
Totally different people.
Totally different people that hated each other.
Yes.
The Sadducees were Roman collaborators. That's why they held on to the high priesthood, because they were willing to work with the Romans. The Pharisees hated the Romans, rejected the temple for the most part because it was run by the Sadducees, and they were sort of fundamentalists. They believed in sort of purity of, in their case, the Torah, of law. And so most of the Pharisees had scribal training, meaning they spent the first 30 years of their life, like we talked about before, copying manuscripts of the Bible. So that was their training. So they knew, that's why we know St. Paul, not just from the way he quotes the Bible, but having gone through that training to become a Pharisee himself, he basically had the Torah memorized. The original Hebrew, and probably most of it in Greek.
Well, how could they pass down religious laws to the people? I'm lost on it. I must be out for lunch or something. I don't know. How could you do that? You have to have some authority other than saying you're a Pharisee and a scribe, and not a Levite.
No, their authority came from their own reputation. That's one of the reasons why they made such a big public show of all this stuff. Right? And they were good at getting mobs together. Well, we'll see that later on, like in the Gospel of John, the woman who gets caught committing adultery. That's one of those interesting. I guess by herself, she was committing adultery. I don't know. This woman gets caught committing adultery by who? By a mob put together by the Pharisees. Right? And that because they couldn't execute anybody officially. But if you get a mob good and riled up, you could get him to kill somebody for you. That's what happens to St. Stephen in the book of Acts. That's what happens, with St. Paul standing there holding everybody's coat while they're throwing rocks. So that was the way they enforced, at least against sinners. They usually chose easy targets. See, that's why you have like the woman caught in adultery and not the man, right? They weren't going to go after any tax collectors, because if you murdered a tax collector, you'd have the Romans looking for you. Right? So they're not going to do that. But some woman who's probably a prostitute, they can get away with stoning her. The Romans don't care. Right? They're not going to waste their breath. Non-Roman citizen. Right? So that's sort of how they tried to draw converts sort of by their reputation for holiness. And they enforced that stuff through just mob justice. And that's part of what was going on in the last chapter when they're coming up with these questions for Jesus. This wasn't just, people who liked egghead debate, right? Jesus has these multitudes following him. They're not just trying to put down Jesus, they're trying to sway the crowds onto their side. Right? They're really those little question and answer sessions or contests trying to who's going to get the crowd with them. Right? Because control of that mob, you can do a lot of damage or do a lot of...
What are the people today? Are those guys with the curls, are they descendants of the Pharisees that have access?
All religious Jews are descendants of the Pharisees. What we now call rabbinic Judaism, what we now call Judaism today, is Pharisee.
You guys with the curls? Or you
No,
say-
all Judaism.
I thought they were scientists.
Well, they are, too, but I'm saying all Jews are descended from the Pharisees.
Oh,
Right? When the temple gets destroyed, there's no more Sadducees. Because all they had going for them was they controlled the temple. Right? And the zealots and these other parties that were following these other messiahs, the Romans wiped them all out. Right? So it's the Pharisees who continue, and that's why the Pharisees are so prominent in the Gospels, because the Gospels are being written later on in the first century, after the temple is destroyed. Right? At this point, you don't hear as much about the Sadducees because they're not relevant anymore. You don't hear, but the Pharisees are still around. Right? And the Pharisees were not only still around, they were claiming they were the real Judaism. Right? And that Christianity wasn't. Right? That Jesus was a false Messiah. So you have at the end of the first century, you have two groups, the Pharisees and the Christians, who claim they're the continuation of the Old Testament. Right? They're both trying to claim what we call the Old Testament. And the Pharisees become what we today call Judaism. And the Christians become what we today call Christianity still. But yeah, that's how it starts out. So that's why the Pharisees are so prominent here. These are the religious ancestors of all of Judaism as we know it today. Now within Judaism as we know it today, there are more conservative and less conservative groups. Just like in Christianity, there are more and less conservative groups, who are on one end or the other. But all of them descend from the Pharisees, from these rabbis.
If the Romans destroyed the temple completely, how can the Jews claim that the Wailing Wall is part of it?
The Wailing Wall is not part of the temple. It's all that's left of the temple complex. The Wailing Wall is a supporting wall that was at the base. It's a retaining wall, essentially, that was at the base below where the physical temple building was. So it's the only part of the temple, the whole complex. Remember we read when Jesus said he was going to destroy it, he was going to rebuild it in 3 days, and they were like, Herod's been building this thing for 42 years, how are you going to how are you going to build it in 3 days? It was more than just the one building. There was a whole series of courts and complex. And and that wall is all that's left of any of it. Any of it. That's how thoroughly the Romans. Because after AD 70, when they leveled the temple, when they came through in 132 at the end of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, they plowed the whole city. They leveled the whole city, including the temple mount. And that's what they changed. They built the new city on top of it, Aelia Capitolina, the capital of the east. And they built a temple to Zeus on the Temple Mount. And they banned, Jews were not allowed to enter the city until after Constantine. They were allowed to come into the city, actually until after Justinian, until the 6th century. Jews weren't even allowed to walk into the city, except for one day a year, which was the 6th of Av, which was the day the temple was destroyed. They could come in there, they could make a procession to where the temple was and weep and mourn, and then leave that one day. Commemorate this. That's all the Romans would let them, the city to do. So that tells you how thoroughly they. And the temple to Zeus was torn down by St. Helena, Constantine's mother. When they came in, they tore down all the pagan temples. But they didn't build anything on the Temple Mount. They just tore it down and left it flat. It was just rubble. And actually became a trash dump for about 200 years. It was a garbage dump. The other place, like they had built a temple to Venus on Golgotha, where Christ was crucified. They tore that down and built the original Church of the Holy Sepulchre there. But they didn't. I mean, they weren't going to rebuild the Jewish temple. They didn't want to have a pagan temple there, but they were going to build it. And so until the Dome of the Rock was built there, it was a garbage dump. So if the story the Muslims tell is true, and that is where Muhammad ascended into heaven, he went to pray in a garbage dump. And then ascended into heaven. Just saying. Because at the time he would have lived, it was a garbage dump. Okay, so yeah, that's why the Pharisees are so prominent. Okay, so he's just getting warmed up here, right, as we've seen, but he's pointing out the problem with the Pharisees is what? Not that they say the wrong things, right? But that they don't do what they say. And when they do the right thing, right? They're not doing it for the right reason. They're doing it to be seen and to get credit for it, to be honored, to receive credit for it. Remember back in the Sermon on the Mount, way back in chapter 5. What was the big issue that Jesus talked about, kept coming back to over and over again? If you do things to be seen by people, you already have your reward. If I go and give a bunch of money and I get my picture on the front of the paper and everybody comes up to me and tells me how wonderful I am, I've got my reward. Right? Nothing waiting for me in heaven. Whereas if I do what I do in secret, right, then God, who knows what we do in secret, will reward us in heaven. Right? So we've come full circle here toward the end of the gospel, where the Pharisees are sort of exhibit A of how not to do these things. How not to do these things. So verse 13, but woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrite. Oh, yeah.
Just as a point, going back, because the verses prior to that where it says, call no one.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, you get this,
Yeah.
you get all these arguments, about you and I should be called about.
Right. Well,
let's look at the context.
Yeah. No, I can bring that. No, because people will point to this. We'll proof text is, see, you shouldn't call priest father, right? Or rabbi or teacher, I guess. But a couple of points to make here. Number one, it doesn't say you shouldn't call religious leaders father. It says you should call no human being father. Which means, I guess, you shouldn't call your father, like your male parent. I guess if you're going to take it that literally, right? And so, do you think what Jesus is saying here is disrespect your male parent? Probably not, right? Especially since he's just said you should respect the authority of the Pharisees because they sit in Moses' seat. Probably he's good with the fourth commandment: honor your father and your mother, right? So it can't be that wouldn't be literal, right? Now you take into account we haven't gotten there yet. It'll be a couple years probably, but St. Paul, right? One of his churches says you have had many teachers in Christ, but I guess we aren't allowed to call them teachers because of the rest of this verse. But anyway, he says, you have had many teachers in Christ, but you have not had many fathers. And he says to them, I am your father, because I have begotten you in the faith, because he's the one who preached the gospel to them, right? He's the one who baptized them. So they became Christians right there through him. And he was spiritually their father. Okay? So then the Bible just contradicts itself. No. What is this saying? This is saying to his disciples, remember who he's talking to? He's talking to the multitudes and his disciples. Right? That they are not to go around looking for titles, looking for people to give them titles and call them these things. Right? He doesn't say he's not saying to the people, don't show respect to anyone. Right? He's saying to them, don't go around looking to be honored the way the Pharisees do. Right? And this was made plain to me. This was made plain to me very soon after I became Orthodox by a priest who I'd never met in person. I was on one of those horrible internet mailing lists that I don't recommend. Right? For people interested in the Orthodox Church, where you get lots of bad information. But there was there was a good priest on there, right? Who posted something on this mailing list, and someone who is a Protestant who was just sort of interested in Orthodoxy responded to him and just called him by his first name. Some old Orthodox people got all up in arms. It's Father so-and-so, or you should at least call him Reverend, or you should, right? You know, disrespectful, I mean, blah, 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 blah. And the priest just came back and said, no, that's fine. Right? I'm not his spiritual father. Right? We don't have that relationship. So there's no need for him to call me that. Right? If someday we have that relationship, he'll call me that. Right? And I won't have to tell him to. He will. Right? And I had a little light bulb go ding. Right? That's what this is all getting at. Right? That's what this is all getting at. It's not wrong to go up to someone and thank them for what they've done to you and tell them you think they're a wonderful person or they did a great job at something. Right? But if you walk around trying to get people to tell you you did a great job and you're wonderful, right? There's a problem with you. Right? I mean, it's that simple, really. Right? It's not wrong to give honor and respect to people. It is wrong to go around demanding honor and respect from people. Right? It's two different things, two different attitudes. Right? Two different spirits at work. Okay? So yes, I'm glad you stopped me to comment on that. Okay. So now we get into this passage starting verse 13 where Jesus says some things that are really un-Christ-like. I'm just warning you now. These are these are passages, for those people who think Jesus was always just nice to everyone. Right? They think that's what love means. Love means just being nice to everyone. Verse 13. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. We talked before about what woe means. Right? We hear woe and it doesn't go. Right? Stopping a horse, no. Woe is the equivalent of, was a curse, right? It's the opposite of blessed, right? It's the opposite of blessed. It is a curse, okay? So, to give you an example, while it's not a translation I'm a big fan of, the guys at the Jesus Seminar did their own translation called the Scholars Version back in the late 80s. But they translated woe to you as damn you. And that's much closer to the idea than most English translations. Okay, so we have to understand the force behind this. Right? This isn't just saying, boy, you guys. Right? This is cursing them. Right? This is cursing them. This is telling them they're going to hell. Right? What do you say? When you say, woe to you. Okay. So woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. For you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Right? What does he mean? All these rules. Right? They're not in the business of trying to help people get into the kingdom of heaven. They're in the business of putting obstacles in people's paths. Right? Why? Because they seem more righteous when there's other people around less righteous than them. Right? They're not in the business of helping anyone find salvation. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation. Right? We talked before about them praying in public. Right? They go on and on and on and on. What do they mean devouring widows' houses? Well, what do you think? Walking around, would you like to make a donation, man? Would you like to give some money to the Lord? Right? It's not going to the Lord, it's going to the Pharisees. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel land and sea to win one proselyte, one convert. And when he is won, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. Yeah. Right? But that's, being judgmental, right? You wonder, why would anyone become a Pharisee? Well, you get to be better than everyone else. Right? That's got a certain appeal to it. I'm the real deal. Right? I'm the spiritual real deal, not like the rest of these peons. And again, there's nobody like that in the church today. But woe to you, blind guides. If your guide is blind, you're in deep trouble. Who say, whoever swears by the temple, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obliged to perform it. Right? This is one of their rules. Okay? Well, if you swear by the temple, right, you got a little wiggle room because that's just a building. But if you swear by the gold of the temple, well, then you got to follow it because the gold of the temple is holy, right? Because it's been dedicated. It's one of their rules about making oaths, right? Say if you swear by the temple and you break your oath, well, that's not that bad because the temple itself is just a building. Okay? But if you swear by the gold of the temple, meaning the things in the temple, right? Those things have been consecrated. Those are holy things. So if you swear by those and you break the oath, well, then that's a big deal.
But if you swear by the temple, you're swearing by Herod. Right?
Well, then,
Well, yeah, you're getting ahead of yourself.
yeah.
But Father, the gold in the temple is not God.
Well, yeah, that's true too. But see, this Jesus follows up, verse 70. Fools and blind, for what is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold? Right? The gold is holy. Why? Because it's in the temple. Right? So he's making a point that this hair splitting, right, is meaningless.
Doesn't make any difference in
Right?
it.
Is meaningless.
The word woe then, is that construed as swearing?
Yeah.
So the Lord is swearing.
Yep.
He's mad.
He's being really un-Christ-like, I told you.
Basically condemning them to hell.
Right. Yeah. Which he has the right to do. Why? Because he's the one who's going to judge the heavens and the earth. Right? He's the judge of the living and the dead.
So that's not swearing.
No,
He's
it's not.
already judged.
Well, that's what he's telling him. He's telling him, if you continue, this is the road you're on. And this is where it ends. You're a good ways down it. Right? Now we're going to come back to this, but keep in mind, he's still saying this to them, which means what? There's still a chance some of them can hear and repent. Right? So he's not actually sending them to hell, but he's telling them that's where you're going. You are on your way. Right?
Take it, since I'm not Christ, I shouldn't be saying these things to others.
You are not the judge of the living and the dead, and therefore,
Do not judge them.
yes, rather, you and I are going to be judged as part of the living and the dead. Hence, judge not lest ye be judged. Verse 18, and whoever swears by the altar, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gift that is on it, he is obliged to perform it. So if you swear by the altar and you break it, you're okay. But if you swear by the sacrifice on the altar and you break it, then you're in trouble.
If something that is on the altar is part of the altar,
Well, no, they be the sacrifice, like the animal that's being sacrificed that's on the altar. Okay. Verse 19, fools and blind, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift? The whole reason the sacrifice is holy is because it's on the altar. Therefore, he who swears by the altar swears by it and by all things on it. He who swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits on it. Right? Meaning what? If you're swearing an oath, I don't care what you swear by, you better keep it. Right? There's not an out. Right? There's not an out. There's not wiggle room. Right? God doesn't acknowledge loopholes. Right? In the Torah. If we say that, it sounds funny. But I can show you video right, of modern day Orthodox Jews with pneumatic elevators. Right? You're not allowed to kindle a fire on the Sabbath, which they interpret as meaning you can't use electricity on the Sabbath. So we have an air-powered elevator so that you can push the button and use the elevator on the Sabbath.
Well, that's where they get the air pressure from. An electric pump.
Yeah.
Electric compressor.
Right. As if God is like, oh, you guys got me on that one. I didn't want you to use the elevators, but you're clever. Right? Right? Like that's how God works. Right? That's easy for us to laugh at. But I've stood a few times in confession and said, well, technically, right? I ate that ham sandwich after sundown. So did I really? Right? When do you count the day started? Right? So we can be just as guilty as anybody. And the point is, God's law, he doesn't acknowledge loopholes. Right? He knows what it means. We know what it means. Right? Instead of spending our time trying to find ways around it to get away with things, we need to be working to try and follow it. Right? That's not what the Pharisees are doing. They're trying to find all the loopholes so that they can excuse themselves and declare themselves to be perfectly righteous. Verse 23, woe to you scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. Blind guides, you strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Well, that's kind of a ridiculous picture. Right? That they're sitting there like, oh no, there's a fly in my soup. Just strain it out. Right? And then they eat a camel. But, which is, of course is what? A big, filthy, unclean animal. But the idea is, again, their concern isn't with actually becoming righteous people. Becoming people who have the righteousness of God. That's not their concern. Their concern is making sure they've followed all the rules so that they can stand in front of people and declare themselves to be righteous. This is the argument that happens at the beginning of Plato's Republic. All of Plato's Republic is a response to one question. And that question is they're debating whether it's better to be righteous or whether it's better to be wicked. Right? There's actually a guy who says it's better to be wicked. Right? Basically, he makes the argument, well, they're pagans. He makes the argument that, hey, there's no real justice in the world. Right? Look at all the people who get away with things. Right? It's better to take your shot, right? And let the chips fall where they may. Get what you can get. Get as far as you can get. And there's another person, of course, that argues it's better to be righteous. It's better to be a just and good person. But then there's a third person who says, no, you guys are both wrong. The best thing to be is to be a wicked person who everyone thinks is a righteous person. That's what you really want. You really want everyone to think you're a good guy, because then you get everything that comes with being a good guy, while secretly you're crooked. Right? You get all the benefits of being crooked. Right? With none of the fault. And so the whole Plato's Republic, the whole book, is about why it's better to actually be righteous than to just appear righteous and really be crooked. Okay? This is the point Jesus is trying to make to the Pharisees.
It looks like Socrates found an honest man.
Yeah. The point of the Torah is for you to become a righteous person, not for you to look righteous in public, right? While secretly you're doing whatever. Right? Not to appear righteous, but actually be righteous. Verse 25, woe to you scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you cleanse the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of extortion and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, that the outside of them may be clean also. Same point, different picture, right? You look at someone like they're an idiot if they took a dirty bowl, right? Wipe the outside and then put food in it, right? Ugh, right? What's wrong with you? Right? But that's what they're doing, right? Clean up the outside, ignore the inside. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appear beautiful outwardly, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Even so, you also outwardly appear righteous to men, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. So this was already at this time. There were the tombs of the prophets, right, that they built there. Some of them are still there. You can see King David's tomb. Unfortunately, Prophet Jonah's tomb was recently destroyed by ISIS. But already at this time, they had, here's the tomb of this prophet, here's the tomb of these Old Testament figures, right? And they built these shrines, and they put all this nice stuff, right? They went around saying, we're not like, all right, remember those guys who threw Jeremiah down the well? We're not like them. No. If we were living back then, we would accept. Just like, every Holy Week, right? I mean, if I'd been there in Jerusalem, I, of course, would have stayed. I would have been right there to the end of Jesus. I would have believed it all. I wouldn't have run off like those other disciples. Right? No, not me. Right? So this is their line that they're going around saying. Verse 31, therefore you are witnesses against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. Right? You just admitted, right, that those are your parents. Remember we talked about earlier this idea of being someone's son in the Semitic languages, right, means more than just you were born their child, right? Remember when Adam and Eve knew each other in Genesis, they brought forth a son, Cain, in what? Adam's likeness. Adam was created in the image of God. Cain comes out in the image of Adam, right? So the idea is, the proverbial apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And you will see sometimes in scriptures it'll refer to, for example, at one point Judas is referred to as the son of perdition. Okay, well that doesn't mean hell had a baby and it was Judas. That means that's his image and his likeness. Okay? So when Jesus says, you've just admitted you're the sons of those who murdered the prophets, he's not just saying, oh yeah, you're admitting that your ancestors did these bad things. Right? He's saying, you're admitting that that's you. Right? That's your heritage. Right? You're admitting that about yourselves. Verse 32, fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. We'll pause there a second too. Fill up the measure of your father's guilt. Does anybody remember a phrase similar to that in the Old Testament? It occurred a few times. In Numbers, when the Israelites come past Edom and Moab. Remember, they kind of go around the bottom of the Holy Land and then come up from the side across the Jordan. When they go past Moab and Edom, remember, God tells them not to attack Moab and Edom. And the reason he says not to is he says, the cup of their iniquity is not yet full. We say, oh, well, what's going to happen when it is? Well, remember what he tells Joshua. The cup of the iniquity of the Canaanites is full. So what happens? Wiped out. Wipe them out. That's it. That's it. So even though this is just this one little line here, you got to feel the weight of what Jesus is saying here. Right? Your ancestors, right? Your heritage, they've already done all these evil things. They've been filling up. Filling up, filling up. Right? He's saying to them, go ahead, top it off. Meaning what? They're going to kill him. They're going to kill Jesus. And once they've killed Jesus, what does that mean? It means it's over for them. And here come the Romans. Right. So that's a weighted phrase there when he tells them to fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. Right? Go ahead and finish it. Finish yourselves off. Serpents, brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of hell? Therefore, indeed, I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city. That on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Assuredly, I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Is that idea again. Starting all the way back with Abel. Right? That cup's been filling up and filling up and filling up. Now notice, here he says, from Abel to Zechariah. Okay? Why would those be the two? Yeah. We're getting there. Some folks will say, oh, well, it's because A to Z. Unfortunately, that Z is not the last letter of the alphabet in Greek or in Hebrew or anything. So that doesn't work. Right? And again, some of our Protestant brothers and sisters who believe in sola scriptura will say, oh, that's Zechariah, who wrote the book of Zechariah in the Old Testament. Right? Unfortunately, Zechariah, not the last book of the Old Testament, right? So you don't get Genesis to, well, Zechariah is not the last one, right? And anyway, it's all right. This Zechariah, who it's referring to, is St. John the Baptist's father. That's Zechariah.
And who was interesting, I think, was the high priest of that.
Who was the high priest then? That's why it says he was murdered in between the altar and the high place.
And that's why.
That's pretty recent, too.
Yeah, it was recent.
Pretty
It was recent. So we're going back to Abel, the very first murder,
All the way right to the present time.
all the way up to,
The high priest that you killed a couple of years ago.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah. That's the A to Z. Right? All the way from then till now.
What did that, where it says son of Berechiah, what did that, they would have known who was talking about?
Oh yeah, they would have, yeah. Yeah. But see, the murder, since the murder of St. John's father is not specifically mentioned in the New Testament, for some of our Protestant brothers and sisters, that didn't happen. But that's what this is.
This is inferring it.
That's what this is a reference to, right? And it's the only reference that makes sense, because again, Zechariah the prophet is not at the end of the Old Testament, right? And A to Z doesn't make sense because that's not the alphabet, right? It would have been somebody whose name started with Omega, right? Alpha, Omega, in Greek. Right? So this is the only way that makes sense, is if he's talking about St. John. the foreigner's father. What he's saying is all that blood, all that wickedness that you've been guilty of, from the very beginning all the way up until now, is all going to fall on this generation. Why? Because you're going to fill it up. And this whole thing's going to come crashing down. God's been patient. He's borne with you up till now.
Why was he killed?
Who?
The father of John the Baptist.
Because he was essentially, along with John, remember he received, we're not in Luke's gospel yet. We'll talk about this more then, because that actually talks about his St. John the Foreigner's birth and everything. But he was the first one to receive the news there's a Messiah coming. Right? Your son is going to be his forerunner. This Messiah is coming. He was killed by Herod's men. Because remember, they went to kill all the babies 2 and under. Right? And St. John was born just a few months before Jesus was. So they killed his father, trying to protect him. And then St. John and his mother fled into the wilderness. Elizabeth died shortly thereafter, and St. John grew up in the wilderness by himself, essentially. He was raised by angels out in the desert.
He was trying to protect John the Baptist.
Yeah. So yeah, that's what happened there historically. And just a note there, I say that's what happened historically, okay, because there's this weird split that happened somehow in the modern mind, even amongst many of our fellow Christians, where if Plutarch writes something about Caesar Augustus that he did, well, that's history, right? But if somebody who lived at the same time as Plutarch writes about something that happened in the Virgin Mary's life, well, that's what? Legend, right? Tradition with a little t, probably bogus, right? And the reason I don't understand that approach is basically you're saying, I believe pagans like Plutarch, but all those early Christians were liars. That's essentially what you're saying, right? So you don't doubt any of these pagans writing about other pagans. But any Christian writing about any Christian person is automatically suspect somehow. Right? We're suspicious of, that probably didn't happen. Right? And I don't quite get the mindset, other than kind of a Romophobia, where, it's like, that's all Catholic stuff, and I don't like Catholics, or something. So aside from that, just kind of knee-jerk reaction, it doesn't make a lot of sense, especially since archaeologically, everything we're finding is backing up all of these documents. Right? A perfect example is, until 2 years ago, all the popular scholarly opinion was that all the stories about St. Thomas going to India and converting people to Christianity there were all nonsense. They were all made up. Complete fiction. Right? Not a word of truth to it. And one of the big arguments they made was, all the stories have to do with him and this King Gwandafer. What's now the Malabar province of India. Well, there was no king named Gwandafer. And that's not even that name doesn't even fit the time and the place. Right? It's not even a good fake name. Right? For an Indian king. This is all nonsense. 2 years ago, they were digging in the Malabar province of India, not just one. They found hundreds of coins stamped King Gwandafer with a big picture of him. In the exact place where all the stories said St. Thomas went. And all the Indian Christians there went, no, we told you St. Thomas came here. He told us about Jesus. Yeah, we told you this, right? And then all of a sudden, all the European scholars went, maybe somebody did go there. I don't know. but and even some of the same people who doubt all these things love Old Testament archaeology. They're all about the Old Testament archaeology, but they just toss all the details. So anyway, that's why I don't refer to it as legends or traditions. I just refer to it as historical data. Because that's what it is. If it was about Caesar, it would be historical data. If it was about Cicero, it would be historical data. If it was about Plato, it would be historical data. So the fact that it's about St. Peter, still historical data. So that's why I called it
The
that.
big difference is that what makes it non-historical is that we're talking about somebody who's still alive.
Well, that doesn't make it not historical.
So all of a sudden it makes a difference if you're talking about somebody, the Son of God who exists today. Then all of a sudden we
Right.
imply something a little bit different.
But Jesus still existed historically. That's the incarnation. So yeah, but I'll get off my soapbox now about that. But okay. So all of this, it's sort of like the sword of Damocles, been hanging over Israel. It's all about to come crashing down. Verse 37, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you, you shall see me no more till you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. He's not referring to Palm Sunday because that already happened. So, even though he just pronounced all this judgment's about to come crashing down on you, is that because he's angry?
No.
Right? Is that what he's saying? God's angry, God's full of wrath, God's finally going to smite you, you're going to get what you deserve? No. Right? He says, I wish I could come here like a mother had gathered her chicks and just gather you all up. Right? And bring you to salvation. But what? You wouldn't have it. Right? They've rejected him. He hasn't rejected them. People reject Christ. Christ doesn't reject people. So now chapter 24. Chapter 24, if you don't already know it, we're going to learn a nice big word today. This chapter in Matthew is often called the eschatological discourse. Discourse means conversation. And this E is important. Because eschatological discourse would be something completely different.
Scatological discourse is what we just finished.
Yeah. So, eschatological, which is a form of the word eschatology. We know basically what ology means, right? Biology is the study of life, right? Theology is the study of God. Geology is the study of the earth, right? So eschatology comes from the Greek word eschatos, which means the last or the end. So it's the study of the last things or the study of the end. Literally. Okay. And so we're talking about now, this is called this because this chapter, Jesus turns to talking about the last things that are coming in the future. And we saw in the Old Testament prophets, they referred all the time to the last days, right? In the last days or in those days, right? Talking about in the future. Some of these things we've already seen happen that the prophets prophesied, right? One of those that the Messiah was going to come, right? We've seen all through St. Matthew's Gospel, he's been showing us places where those prophecies were fulfilled, right? Where Jesus fulfilled those prophecies. Jesus is now going to talk about what's going to happen in the last days, meaning Christ's death, right, which is now approaching, which he's already been talking about, is going to begin the last days. So when the prophets were talking about in those days and the last days, right, that time period in the future, Jesus is now saying that time period in the future is starting now. In St. John's Gospel, right, Jesus says over and over again, reflecting this, the time is coming and now is. Right? Time is coming and now is when all who lay in the tombs will hear the voice of the Son of God. Time is coming and now is when all who worship God will worship Him in spirit and in truth. It's that same kind of idea. Right? Those last days you heard about, right? They're coming up, but they're also starting right now with Jesus. And so when we get to 1 John in the epistles later, he's going to say, brethren, these are the last days. Right? We're in them. Okay? Now, that's important. That part, the fact that we're already in them, is very important. Because a lot of folks will interpret this eschatological material in the New Testament as if it's still somewhere out in the future. Right? Like everything's just going to sort of plod along, and then all of a sudden we're going to get to the last days. Right? And then this is going to happen, and 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 this is going to happen, this is going to happen. Right? They have the big chart. John Hagee, he has a big chart. Right behind them while they preach, and they point and say, here's this and here's that and here's the other. Right? But that's not the perspective of the New Testament. Right? That's the perspective of the Old Testament. Right? The Old Testament kept saying there's going to be these latter days. Right? But the perspective of the New Testament is, as soon as Christ shows up on this earth, that's the beginning of the end. Right? That's the beginning of the end. Now these last dominoes are going to tip. Right? And as we go through the New Testament, we're going to see most of them tip. Because remember, what were the things Isaiah and Ezekiel were predicting? They were predicting that the people of Israel, the people of Judah, were going to be judged. Right? Is that about to happen? Yeah. Right? That's about to happen. They predicted that after that, there'd be a remnant of the Jews who was purified by that, and then all the Gentiles would come and be added to them to worship God. Is that about to happen? Right? Starting in the book of Acts. Right? St. Paul's going to bear witness to that. Right? So all these things in the last days, boom, boom, boom. And so that's why when St. John writes 1 John and he says these are the last days, he's saying all those things that were supposed to happen in the last days have already happened. Right? There's only one thing left. That's Jesus coming back. Right? And we'll get to that. But you know, in the liturgy, when we pray and we recount the whole dispensation, the whole covenant, right? Everything Christ has done. Cross, grave, resurrection on the third day, ascension into heaven, sitting at the right hand of God. Those already happened. The only thing left is the second glorious coming. So that's important. There's nothing else that has to happen first. And especially when we get into the book of Revelation, as we go through, I'll try and show you where some of these misinterpretations come from. This idea that there are all these other things that still have to happen before there's going to be 7 years of this and 1,000 years of that. But we'll get to that. But this is from Jesus' own mouth now. Okay? This is from Jesus' own mouth now. And one more note before we get started. What we're going to see in this chapter, I won't go into the technical term for it because it's not worth it. But as we saw in Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and the other prophets, when they talked about the last days, right? All those things we just mentioned, right? The Messiah coming, judgment coming upon Israel, the Gentiles being included, right? They tended to sort of smush all those together, right? Whereas they took place over the course of, basically a century. right, when they actually happened, right? They kind of got all condensed together. Okay, what we're going to see when Christ here starts talking about what's to come, we're going to see the judgment of Israel and the destruction of the temple, right, and his return. All of that is going to kind of get smushed and condensed together. So he's going to move back and forth between talking about one and the other. Right? Because Jesus is saying this to the people in the temple on that day, right, about what's going to happen to the temple they're standing in. Right? He's not coming to them and saying, okay, look, I know this isn't totally pertinent to you guys because there's like 2,000 years before any of this stuff is going to go down, but let me just lay this out because St. Matthew's over there writing it down. That's not it. Okay, he's talking to them, right, about information that's pertinent to them, because most of them are still going to be alive in 38 years, right, when the Romans show up. Okay. So he's talking to them about information that's pertinent to them. Okay. But included in that, right, is going to be the prophecies concerning his return. Right, that's also relevant to us, which is why St. Matthew bothers to, out of everything Jesus said, which is St. John tells us there aren't enough books in the world to contain every single word he ever said, right? But that's why St. Matthew picks this to give to us now, right? Because it's also still relevant to us. Okay. So chapter 24, verse 1, then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. Right, so remember, in the evening, they were leaving the city. Daytime coming back to the city. So Jesus is done teaching in the temple. He said his piece. Pharisees have taken off. He's told them where to go. Right? And now they get up to leave the temple, and as they're leaving, right, the disciples kind of pause, the Judean sunset, look back at all these magnificent buildings Herod has built. Right? And say, oh, look at all these magnificent buildings. Right. Verse 2, and Jesus said to them, do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, so now they've finished going out of the city. As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Okay. When they say the sign of your coming, do they mean, okay, we finally figured out this whole crucifixion and resurrection thing? And then we figure you'll probably wait, a month, 40 days, and then you'll go into heaven, and then a couple thousand years, sometime you'll come back? That's not what they're saying. Right? When they say you're coming, they mean, hey, when are you going to, this teaching in the temple thing's nice and everything, but when's the whole enthronement going to happen? Right? When's the big fight between you and the Romans going to start? Right? What's the end game here? Right? We went in, we were occupying the temple, right? What's going on? At the end of the age, right? What's the sign? What's our cue to go? Right? To draw our swords and go for it. And Jesus answered and said to them, take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Okay? So now we got to pause for a second. Right? Because some of our Christian brothers and sisters will read this and interpret this and say, oh, okay, this is for us, right, for us. He's talking to me right now. And the way I'm going to know that Jesus is about to come back is that all this stuff is going to happen. Right? So if I pick up my newspaper and I hear about wars and earthquakes and famines and stuff, oh, Jesus must be about to come back. Right? Or so Jack Van Impe told me. So, but is that how his disciples could have possibly understood it? Right? Right, he couldn't have. Right? But what does that say to the apostles? Because the apostles are coming up to him and saying, okay, what's the end game here? And he's saying, well, there's going to be all these people showing up claiming to be the Messiah. There's going to be wars, earthquakes, and famines. So I guess that's not this week, right? Right? Jesus is coming back to them and saying, this isn't something that's about to happen. Right? This isn't something that's about to happen. There's going to be some time. There's going to be a period of time. And during that period of time, all kinds of crazy stuff's going to happen. Right? Now it turns out, we now know that's 2,000 plus years, right? And all kinds of crazy stuff has happened during that 2,000 plus years. People have showed up claiming to be the Messiah. Right? All over the world, all kinds of false religious movements have shown up. And there have been earthquakes, and there have been horrible wars, and there have been all kinds of atrocities, and all kinds of things have happened. Right? And so Jesus is saying to us the same thing he was saying to them. During that period of time when all this is happening, don't get concerned. Don't say, oh, he's never coming. Oh, he's never going to establish the kingdom. I guess those promises were bull, or we understood them wrong. Right? When all that's going on, remember, this has to happen first. Okay? Verse 9, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Right? He's not prophesying some future persecution of Christians. Right? 2,000 years in the future. He's telling the apostles, they are going to kill you. You people who are here listening to me. And that happened, right? That happened. Every one of them but St. John was killed, and St. John basically spent not the better part, the worst part of his life in a salt mine, right? In exile, right? Verse 10, and then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. Because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. So, Jesus is saying, kingdoms, still a few things have to happen, right? Before the kingdom gets established. Right? And the last one is what? This gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. Okay. Some of our, again, well-meaning Christian brothers and sisters have taken this verse to mean, well, this means right, that until every person in the world, in the literal globe, right, has had a chance to hear about Jesus, he won't return. And that's a wonderful misinterpretation, because it's led to people translating the Bible into all kinds of languages and all kinds of missionary activities, which are all good things, but that's not what he's saying. Right? That's not what he's saying. Because, we'll hit pause here. We skip to the end of Matthew's Gospel. I know I'm cheating a little. It's only 4 more chapters. Chapter 28, right before he ascends into heaven, Jesus tells them what? Preach the gospel. Right? Preach the gospel. Okay? Right. Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And when we get to the book of Acts, you'll notice they preach the gospel in Judea. And then they preach the gospel St. Philip in Samaria. And then through St. Paul, as missionary journeys, they go to the whole world. Okay? So this was done at the end of the book of Acts. Right? This is done at the end of the book of Acts. That's why the narrative stops at the end of the book of Acts. There's no more narrative things still happened in church history. Right? But they're not in the New Testament. Why? Because that's the last thing that's happened before Christ's return. And when Christ returns, we won't have to bother to write a book about it, because we'll all see it. Right? So that's why it stops there. Okay? So he's telling them about what's going to happen to them. Right? You are going to face persecution, my disciples, my friends who are here. You are going to be killed for my sake. But you are also going to go and take the gospel of the kingdom, the good news of the kingdom, all through the world, to all the nations, to all the Gentiles. Right? And welcome them in. And then the end will happen. Verse 15, therefore when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Okay, let's press pause there a second. Okay. We have an editorial comment here from St. Matthew. He breaks the fourth wall. That's a note from St. Matthew, that let the reader understand. Shakespeare used to do that a lot. If you read Shakespeare's plays, he'll have a character sort of turn to the audience. Make a comment about what's going on, right? That's what St. Matthew's doing. He's making a turn to the audience. He's like, let the readers, I mean, this is code, right? It's been about the abomination of desolation. Okay? Well, first, why would he have to use code? Because there's someone who he doesn't want to understand what he's saying, right? That's why you use a code, to try and hide what you're saying from somebody. What was the abomination of desolation? We did Daniel right before Matthew, but we've been in Matthew a long time, so I know. In Daniel, the abomination of desolation was, remember, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Remember, he gave himself the title Epiphanes, which means the appearance of God. It's a nice nickname to give yourself. Antiochus IV Epiphanes, remember, he went and attacked. He was the emperor of the Seleucid Empire. Right? There was the Greek Empire over Syria, the area that included Judea. He went and attacked the Ptolemaic Empire that ruled Egypt and lost badly. And he lost badly even after all of his augurs and seers and everything told him that the gods were on his side. So he needed to come up with an explanation for this. This doesn't happen. Why would the gods do this to him? Well, look at these Judeans. They won't worship Zeus, Hermes, Apollo, etc., etc., etc. Right? The gods must be mad. Right? The Judeans won't worship them. And that's why they had me lose. So he does what? He goes to Jerusalem and sacrifices a pig to Zeus on the altar in the temple. And that act was called by the Jews the abomination of desolation. It's an abomination, obviously, because he's sacrificing a pig to Zeus right, on God's altar. It leads to desolation, meaning now the whole temple was made unclean by it. Right? And so we know they just abandoned the temple. They just left it in ruins. They couldn't use it anymore after that. Unity of people. And this is what touched off, remember, the Maccabean revolt. This is what got Judas Maccabeus and his brothers upset. Right? Caused them to rise up and overthrow the Seleucids, at least temporarily. Right? Create the independent nation of Judea. Then they had the brilliant idea of, I know who can help us against the Greeks and keep our independence. The Romans. Let's make a treaty with them. And that's what got the Jews where they were in Jesus' time, right? Because the Romans came in and annexed them based on that treaty. But so, this is what Jesus is referring back to here. When he says, when you see the abomination of desolation, he's referring to what? A pagan emperor coming and essentially destroying the temple, right? Because they couldn't use it. They couldn't use it after that. Okay. So again, verse 15, therefore when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place. Whoever reads, let him understand. Right? He doesn't come out and say Matthew's writing this down after the fact. Right? He doesn't come out and say, when you see Titus and his Roman legions marching on,
Jerusalem.
right? Why? Because they're still living under the Romans. Right? They're still living under the Romans. And why did the Romans do that? To put down a Jewish revolt against the Romans. Right? So St. Matthew here doesn't want to give the impression that he was part of that revolt. Right? That he, and so he says, he kind of encodes it. We're going to see more of this later on. So for example, when St. Peter writes one of his epistles, he writes it from Rome. He says he's writing from Babylon. Right? Well, the readers would know, Babylon was a ruin at that time in history, the actual city Babylon. But who knew the Old Testament, Babylon was what? It was sort of the evil empire, right, that destroyed Judah. And so, when he says he's writing from the city of Babylon, they kind of, okay, yeah, he's in Rome, right? You don't want to let on he's in Rome, because then finding him in Rome is how Nero killed him. But, okay, so that's the reason for the code. Okay, so Jesus says, when you see this, right, when you see a pagan emperor standing in the temple, then flee to the mountaintops, right? Flee, get out of town. Get out of town. Is he just warning them? In general, let me give you guys a heads up. The bad stuff's going to happen. No. He's saying flee to the mountaintops as opposed to what? As opposed to participating in the Jewish revolt that leads to this. Right? Big part of what he's telling them, these people are going to show up claiming to be the Messiah. You're going to hear about these wars and these insurrections. He's telling them, if you're following me, right? If you're following Jesus, if Jesus is the king, if he's the Messiah, right? These other guys are phonies. Have nothing to do with them. Right? You don't need to be any part of these revolts. Right? So he's not just giving them a warning that will save their lives if they follow it, right? To have nothing to do with these revolts. And this historically, by the way, happened. This historically happened. The Christians, when the Jewish revolt started in 66, that led to the destruction of the temple in AD 70, the Christians all fled and hid in Petra, among other places, in what was Edom, and it's now Jordan. Right? They went and fled and hid outside the city. Well, how did they know? Because Jesus actually said this. Right? Because Jesus actually said this. Because they were tipped off in advance by Christ.
So this book of Matthew was already written and disseminated to people?
No, that's the point I'm making.
I'm sorry.
This was written after the fact. But historically, the Christians all fled in 66 before this was written down. So how did they know? They can't have known from reading Matthew. So they must have known from Jesus actually telling them this. Right? That's evidence that this actually occurred. That this isn't Matthew after the fact saying, oh yeah, Jesus knew this was going to happen. Right? Making it up. Because the Christians historically actually fled at the beginning of the revolt. They actually did this. Verse 17, let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. Let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been seen since the beginning of the world until this time, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. Therefore, if they say to you, look, he is in the desert, do not go out. Or look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. Okay. So to go back through this, right? And again, this is a passage that a lot of our Christian brothers and sisters try to push off into the future. Right? As being Jesus, well, he's talking to them, but he's talking about stuff that's going to happen more than 2,000 years later. Right? So, for example, they talk in verse 23, right? Look, here's the Christ, there's the Christ. What's the whole point? He's saying to them, right? In AD 66, right? Somebody's going to show up claiming to be the Christ, claiming to be the Messiah, gathering up followers to go and overthrow the Romans. Right? This isn't some theoretical thing. This isn't a prophecy about some false prophet somewhere in the future. This happened while the disciples were still alive. Right? In AD 70, around the destruction of the temple by the Romans. People showed up claiming to be the Messiah. Bar Kokhba, again, at the end of the century, showed up claiming to be the Messiah in 128 and got Jerusalem wiped out. Right? Jesus is saying, when they pop up, have nothing to do with them. Right? Nothing to do with them. Now, again, that it also has relevance to us. Right? In that we have all kinds of quote-unquote prophets popping up all the time, talking about end times this, end times that. Right? One of the most dramatic examples being in the middle of the 19th century here in the United States. During the Second Great Awakening, the whole Adventist movement, the Great Disappointment. Right? People literally sold everything they had. Sold their family farms. So I think the first date was what, 1842? I think was the first date. Was it 1842? Jesus is coming back. Right? Jesus is coming back. Sold everything they had. Went to these prayer meetings waiting for him. Well, guess what? He didn't show. These families were left destitute. The so-called prophets said, well, we did the math around 1843. Right? 1843. Nothing happened then either. Right? And then some of them, Ellen G. White said, well, Jesus came from one part of heaven to another part of heaven. And so now we're going to be Seventh-day Adventists. Right? and Russell started the Jehovah's Witnesses the same way. Right? Jesus went from the celestial heaven to the terrestrial heaven. Right? And all these, so this has happened in our lifetime. Our lifetime even. What was, we started the Bible study. Camping. Harold Camping just a few years ago, remember? He had the date. This is the date Jesus is returning. Nothing happened. He said, okay, I did the math wrong. 6 months later, this is the date, for sure. Didn't happen. Now, at least Harold Camping had the decency after the second one didn't pan out to say, okay, I guess I was wrong. And he just retired from the ministry. I respect him for that. Right? That he didn't go and start a cult. But then he actually stepped back and said, you know what, I guess I was wrong. Right? That's at least, right? So it's not just relevant to them. It was relevant to them. Very relevant to them. Right? Don't be a part of these movements, these revolts. But it's still relevant to us today. Right? When these things pop up. Don't go chasing. Why? Because when Jesus returns, whereas the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will it come at the coming of the Son of Man be. You'll see it.
And there won't be any warning.
Yeah.
It's just gonna happen.
You'll know. Okay? You're not going to have to go wait in a field somewhere. You're not going to have to go wear the matching Nikes, right? None of this, right? You'll know when Jesus comes back. Okay? Until then, right? Endure, because it's going to be rough. Right? Because it's going to be rough.
I just wanted to comment that didn't we have the same thing with people committed suicide when the hail ball comes?
Yeah, same kind of
the
thing.
same way, and I'm sure that this was it.
Right. Right, and Jesus is saying, don't go chasing around.
Gotta look at
Right.
Job.
When the kingdom comes, you'll know. Right? When the kingdom comes, you will know. Everyone will know. A couple other notes. This business about the elect here. Remember we talked before about the way that word is used, right? Elect or chosen. Right? Who do you think it's referring to here? He's talking about people fleeing from Jerusalem before the destruction, right? And the time of that destruction being cut short for their sake. Okay? And then he talks about these phony messiahs showing up, who are going to lead all these people astray, except for this group. So who's this group do you think he's talking about? Christians, specifically that Jewish remnant, right, that the prophets talked about. Right? The ones who believe in Christ. The Jews who believe in Christ. That's who this is talking about. Right? For their sake, God's going to cut short the destruction when it comes upon Jerusalem. Right? Not for the sake of the unbelieving Jews who are now facing the consequences of their actions, but for the sake of those believing Jews. Because again, that's the core of the church in the new covenant. Right? Is this purified remnant of Israel. And then the Gentiles are brought in. The rest of us are brought in.
Can you clarify that about when you say about the Jews who believe in Christ? Because today there are no Jews, like Messianic Jews, that don't understand that part. You're either a Jew or a Christian, and since the temple has been destroyed, then there is no Judaism.
This is referring to the Jewish ethnos, not the religion. The Greek word ethnos, that's where we get ethnic or ethnicity. The best translation of it in this time in history, the way they used it in the first century, was a people. Right? The Jewish people. And so, for example, in the first century, there was a debate as to whether Jews and Samaritans were one ethnos or whether they were each a separate ethnos. The Jews insisted they were separate. Right? The Romans and the Greeks thought they were basically the same. Right? They're like, well, you worship over there, you worship over there, you're basically the same. Right? From their perspective. Right? But of course, if you were Jewish, the Samaritans weren't your people. Right? They were other. But so that's of a people group. Right? So we're talking about the biological descendants of Abraham. Right? The people who we've been reading about through the Old Testament. St. Paul is going to talk about this. Right? When he talks about, why didn't the Jews at all, right, accept Christ? He's going to say, well, some of them did. Right? St. Paul's going to say he's one of them. I mean, that was the core. That's the apostles are all Jews. Right? That's the core of Christianity. But it's as the prophets prophesied, it's this remnant, this leftover remnant of the whole nation that's sort of come through the fire of judgment, and so that judgment wipes out most of the nation, but it sort of refines, like the way gold in a fire refines this remnant. Right? And this judgment that's coming, Jesus is telling them, this judgment that's coming on Judea, I mean, you're going to suffer too, right? You're going to have to flee this, even if you listen to me and obey me, you're going to have to flee the city, you're going to be in hiding, the Romans are going to be coming in. And we now, because we're so far away from this event, don't realize what it was like. If you read Josephus, the first century historian who lived at the time this happened, him talking about 70 AD and the Romans coming in and destroying the temple, I mean, it's blood curdling. There was horrific stuff going on. The Romans laid siege to some of these cities around Jerusalem, and people started eating their infant children in order to survive during the siege because they ran out of food. There were Nabatean ancestors of Arabs, Nabateans outside Jerusalem when the Romans attacked, people who were fleeing the city to try to save their gold coins and gold jewelry would eat them to smuggle them out of the city. Because if they were carrying anything, they would get confiscated. There would amity gangs hanging around outside the city in the mountain passes, cutting people open to get their jewelry. I mean, it was horrific, right? And Jerusalem and all the cities around it burning, right? And the Romans coming through slaughtering people. So we lose sight of just how horrific this event was. When Christ is talking about it as this great tribulation, I mean, it was horrific, for the people who were there at the time. And so when he says, God's going to have mercy for the sake of that believing group, right, and cut it short, he's being serious. This was a horrible, horrible thing that took place. And from the perspective of the Jews who were there, the Romans, of course, thought it was glorious and wonderful. If you go to Rome today, the Arch of Titus that he built when he got back to Rome is still there. And one of the reliefs shows his men carrying off the menorah, the candlestand from the temple, celebrating having destroyed it. They thought it was a glorious victory, right, as far as the Romans were concerned. But it was really this horrific event. And I'd like to go on, but I've gone on long enough, I think, for this evening. Next week, are people going to be here? It's Memorial Day weekend. Are folks going to be here? Yes,
Sure.
no?
Our family will be
No, that
in
didn't
town,
change.
so we may not. Kids will be.
Yes, no?
Kids will be.
Yes. Okay, I think we'll have a quorum. Okay, so next week we'll come back and we'll pick up here where we left off in chapter 24 and hear more happy stories about the end times and the destruction of Jerusalem and the world.